那今天就是很高兴今天邀请到 Melody 说来跟我们分享她的职涯经验。然后 Melody 是2003年北一毕业的，然后我看资料上面你是信班嘛？你是1年级在信班吗？还是说你毕业的时候？
不是1年级预班，然后因为文组，所以23年级转信班。
23年级转信班 ，OK。
对。
然后就Melody 毕业之后就到美国来，然后今天呢，他要来跟我们分享他的职涯的经验，就是一路从投资，然后念 MBA， 然后到 startup， 然后最后又变回投资人这样子。那因为我们觉得他的经验其实是大家都非常有兴趣，尤其现在非常多人都对 startup 有兴趣，那所以我们就邀请到他来跟我们ABF 的 Millennium 来分享。那基本上在今天的过程中，我们会先请 Melody 自我介绍，然后讲一下她的经历，然后呢，我们可能会提一些问题，就是根据一些校友有表达非常有兴趣的部分，然后可能我们就会问一些比较深入的问题这样子，然后到了后面大概10几20分钟的时候，我们会留给大家 Q&A。对，好，那我们就先欢迎 Melody， 那我就先请 Melody 开始自我介绍这样子。
OK， 大家好，我是 Melody，中文名叫寇福明。那我之前有跟主办人说我尽量会中英交杂，但是最后可能会讲偏英文讲，然后所以我尽量会讲慢一点。那我是2003年北一毕业的，然后毕业以后就来到美国念大学。那我直接是去 University of Virginia， 所以我就搬到 University of Virginia Charlottesville， 然后在那边念UVA 的 undergrad business program，UVA 有一个 2-year undergrad business program， 所以我那时候是主修 finance and accounting。那 upon graduation， 我那时候对 investment banking 比较有兴趣，所以就一直在学校的时候一直就是 focus 在 how do I get a job in investment banking， 然后fortunately 就是有机会大3的暑假在 Morgan Stanley 纽约实习，然后后来就 successfully got a full-time investment banking job。我后来搬到纽约的时候是在一个 boutique investment bank 叫 Evercore。当时真的是一个 boutique， 现在已经不是一个 boutique。那所以我就一直大学毕业后就一直到纽约在纽约工作。那 investment banking 做了2年，然后其实一直都并没有说要计划说 long term 做 investment banking， 只是为了学一些banking 可以教我的经验。那 banking 做完2年后，通常 banking 做完2年，大家都去 private equity 或是 hedge fund。所以当初我在找工作的时候，我想说应该是 interview 一些 middle market private equity fund 或是 hedge fund。那误打误撞，其实就是真的是误打误撞进入了创投，就是 venture capital。所以我 banking 做了2年以后，我就变成一个，我就有机会到VC 去做。那当时的 VC 的 job 是 Time Warner， 就是那时候叫时代华纳，现在已经没有这个公司，后来被 AT&T 并购。那当初 Time Warner 是一个$30 billion company， 那它有一个 corporate venture team， 就是说它虽然说它是一个media company， 但它有一个 balance sheet investment vehicle， 所以你可以就是一个非常小的团队，专门做创投，就专门投资新创公司startup， 就是 Series A、Series B、digital media、internet startups。那也是在纽约，所以我就在纽约又做了2年venture capital investing。那 startup investing 跟 investment banking 其实是一个非常不一样的工作，所以也非常不 quantitative， 就是 investment banking 是非常 quantitative， 就是 spreadsheet Excel 这个那个的。但是VC 是一个非常 qualitative 的工作，所以我的 day to day 就是一天到晚跟 startup founder 喝咖啡，然后 network， 然后一直去在纽约的 startup ecosystem 一直认识人，然后这在 industry parley 叫 sourcing deals， 就是你试着要去参加活动干嘛，然后你要 stay ahead of the trend， 然后you're trying to figure out like who are the good people that we should bring in as founders to meet because we want to find a new investment opportunity。 所以那个工作我等于是一个 junior VC 的 job， 然后我做了2年，然后后来决定去申请 business school。这个我们可以，如果等一下大家有兴趣，我可以讲就是为什么当初要申请 business school。那最后就是，其实我本来是并没有很特别想要去念 business school， 因为 business school 很贵。那我 undergrad 也是念 business， 我想说还蛮浪费钱的，就是已经 undergrad 已经读完了，已经读了 finance and accounting， 然后我也做 banking， 就是非常 finance 的工作。 然后就是所以我那时候并就是有点犹豫不决，说到底要不要再去念个 MBA。那后来就申请到 Harvard Business School， 我想说，如果不去有点浪费，所以就去了。然后所以就去了。那 Business School 2年，就是起码会花个15-16万，就是你不加 lodging 啊，不加 travel 啊这些东西的。那还好，就是说我之前在做 investment banking 的时候有存够钱，所以大部分都是自己付，不用拿学生贷款。然后我一到 campus， 然后就开始脑子就想东想西，就开始想要自己做自己创业的 idea。所以虽然说不是 it's not part of the plan， 因为就是如果我真的想要创业，我就当初不应该去浪费$15万去念 MBA。但就后来发生的事情就是说，我到了学校3个礼拜，然后我就开始在想这个 idea， 然后我就跟很多因为 MBA 是就是很多旁边都有很聪明的同学，然后就跟大家一直 bounce idea， 说你觉得这怎么样？然后 at some point just like okay I can't just keep thinking about it， 因为我如果一直想也不知道说到底会不会成功，所以我想说 okay the only way to know actually works is to actually work on it。 所以 long story short， 就我在 MBA 的2年，我大部分都是在做我自己的公司，所以是一个还蛮辛苦的。因为就是在 HBS 其实不能翘课，他翘课你会被踢出去。所以虽然说 MBA 通常是很多玩乐的事情，但是就是在 Harvard你还是必须得去上课，然后还是得参与学校的一些学术性，就是基本的 minimum level studying 你必须要去做。那但是就是我剩下的时间全部都在做自己的 startup。那后来这个 startup 没有成功，然后中间还蛮曲折，就是我的 co-founder 是我的 classmate， 然后我们后来报名一个 accelerator，就是中文叫什么加速器，就是有募资一点，就是加速器会给你一些资金，然后这是等于就是我的 internship。那后来中间发生什么事情，就是做到快要 demo day 的时候，我的 co-founder 居然跟我说，他说我不做了，我要去找别的工作，这样。所以还蛮就是 it's a pretty interesting learning experience， 就是算是说personal 跟 professional 以来最大的一个挫折吧。那后来2年 MBA 快毕业的时候，就是我就没有这个 energy 再继续做 founder， 我想好吧，那我得去找工作。那在 MBA 的时候，通常会有很多那种大公司会来雇人。那我有试着去听过一场，就是他们会来学校讲，就是这叫什么 career fair， 他们就会来学校讲，就说Amazon， 然后我们要招什么样的人，怎样怎样。那我有去参加过一场，我记得我就走进去那个 Amazon 的那个讲座，然后我在那边坐了15分钟，我就想哇太无聊了，我绝对没办法在大公司工作，然后我就闪人了。就那场听完以后，我就再也没有参加过其他的大公司和小公司的讲座，然后我也从来没有在学校 interview 过，我也不知道学校 interview 到底要怎么用。所以我的 job search 完全就是 networking， 因为我想说我一定得在 startup 做，我毕业以后我没有办法忍受我在大公司做的那种感觉，所以我的毕业以后就 network search， 我就回到纽约当初加入了一个 late stage startup 叫 fab.com。 那我当初是非常想要转到 product management， 但是其实要转到 product management 还蛮困难，因为我大学不是念CS computer science， 或者我也不是 technical degree， 所以通常人家不喜欢雇不是 technical background 的 PM， 那尤其是没有经验没有做过 product management 的人，所以当初其实找那个工作还蛮难找。那我是又想要做 PM 又没有做过 PM， 然后又想要一定得在纽约，因为我当初的 boyfriend 现在的 husband 他是在纽约，那然后呢一定得进去一个 startup， 所以我就依赖了我以前做 VC 的时候的 network， 就是角逐，就是叫什么，就是非常我毕业的时候没有工作，所以我毕业后来2-3个月，我一边 wedding planning 一边找工作。然后其实我有一些 classmate 就是非常刚好想要做 startup 的人，也都是一直都没有工作，因为you have to be comfortable not having a job when you graduate if you want to work at a startup because it's very network driven. The timing is very random. 所以但后来就是还蛮幸运，就是 network 进到 fab.com， 那时候他们这个公司已经 Series C， 他们 raised a lot of money。然后在那边做了7个月以后，被 recruit 到另外一个 startup， 那这个 startup 是 Blue Apron。那我那时候 Blue Apron 那时候大概Series A， 然后刚 刚是 headquarter 大概20个人左右，那他们那时候是要找他们第一个 product manager， 那这个也是因缘际会，为什么会到 Blue Apron， 是因为 Blue Apron 的 founder CEO 跟我以前在做 VC 的时候就认识，因为他以前也是 VC， 然后他就辗转听到说我后来在做 product， 然后他就寄给我 email 说，嘿，我现在是这个 startup company called Blue Apron 的 CEO 怎样，你要不要来？我们要找 first product hire， 你要不要来？那刚好我那时候已经是一个 Blue Apron 的 customer， 所以我已经有用过 Blue Apron 这个产品几个月，所以我就 I was a believer, so I actually liked the product, and so that was a pretty coincidental opportunity. So I went in to interview with them Christmas Eve in late 2013. So this company was about like 18 months old, raised about $8 million, and just started growing. And and then like we can talk about kind of decision making then if people are interested. 但是 anyhow, so early 2014 我就加入 Blue Apron. So I was the first product hire. We're about 20 people. And it was a pretty interesting ride. So that was probably, I was at Blue Apron for about 3.5 years. And that was probably the most single-handedly the most transformative professional experience for me personally. 因为 I had the opportunity to kind of grow with the company as it went through hyper growth. So when I joined, to give people some perspective, when I joined, we had about 20 people. We were in a co-working space, 2 conference rooms, just like IKEA desk. And the week I joined, we were a little too big to stay in the co-working space. So we had to move into our first real office. But we didn't have IT, we didn't have locks on the door. So everybody had to bring their laptop to work so you can like bring the laptop home. So everybody wore the backpacks to the CEO for the first 2 months. And then 9 months later, we got to probably like 100 people. And the month I joined, our revenue run rate was $40 million. At the end of the year, we're at $100 million. So this is a pretty crazy growth. And 3.5 years, we probably grew 25x from like a revenue perspective. And when I joined, we had 20 people in corporate. When I left, which was 2 months after IPO, we had about 500 people in corporate. And then my job there, so I joined as the first product hire. We had 3 engineers on the team. We had 0 product people. So I was the first one reporting to one of the founders and the CTO. And then we just kept growing, and then we kept hiring engineers. 9 months later, we had 3 product people, a designer who was reporting to me, and we had 20 engineers. And then my boss, who was a CTO and one of the co-founders, was like, we need a head of product. And I was like, oh, I think so too. And he's like, do you want to be the head of product? I was like, okay. And then he basically tortured me for 6 months to make sure that like I was ready, and asked me 1,000 questions every time we had a one-on-one, and be like, oh, what would you do about our roadmap? And 2 weeks later, I was like, oh, here's what I would do about a roadmap. And then 2 weeks later, I was like, oh, what's your plan for the org? What's your org hiring plan? And then 2 weeks later, I go back, like, here's an org design, here's a hiring plan. So he basically tortured me for 6 months, and finally, basically, and then the first transition was very awkward because he put all the other product managers who were my peers under me, because I basically was elevated to the head of the team. So that was pretty awkward. And then I had to go hire a bunch of people, and then they kept adding more to my plate. So the next thing was like, oh, we need to expand our product design team. Do you want to run the product design team? I was like, okay, I don't really have a choice. So I would go around the product design team. I need to go hire 6 product designers, and I'm not even a designer. And then I have to go find their bosses. And the product management team was getting too big, so I need to hire director, senior director level people. But I wasn't titled senior enough to hire really senior people. So that was all very challenging. And then my last year there, they're like, oh, we need a stronger analytics and data science team. And the story there is our previous head of analytics didn't work out. So it was under our CFO, and she was just not the right person to run that team because it's pretty technical. And then everybody looked around and like, oh, Melody, you're pretty analytical. You can run an analytics team. And the analytics team had like 2 people, and it needed to be a 15-person team. So that was really challenging as well. So I basically had to hire a new head of analytics and basically built that team out. So by the time I left, my team was about 35 people, and it was a lot of work because I basically was a hiring manager for about most of them. And then I eventually hired their bosses. And then I no longer had to manage 13 people at the same time. So that was a lot of fun, but a lot of work. And I was there for almost 4 years. And as Blue Apron was preparing to go IPO, I was like, well, that's kind of a good transition to kind of just like, there's so many chapters I experienced with the company. And to be honest, my last 6 months as a VP of product at the company was my least favorite 6 months, even though I was the most senior and I had more responsibility and I was on the senior team, because it just became more political. And my job was like, I just stuck in meeting all day. And I described my job as I'm politicking so that my people can do work. And that was not very interesting to me. And I also learned that this is a kind of a personal understanding that I don't think I'm good, or I'd like to be an exec at a large company. And Blue Apron was only getting larger, especially if we were to become a public company. So I started thinking, okay, maybe after IPO, I would go do something else, but I wasn't sure what I was going to do. And my partners at NextView, which is the venture capital firm that I'm currently a partner at, reached out to me, and we've known each other for about a decade as well. Also met them when I was a junior VC, way back when my second job out of college. And they reached out to me. We've kept in touch professionally. So they've been tracking my career. And they were like, hey, do you want to join one of our portfolio companies as a VP of product? I was like, oh, I'm not interested in that. And they're like, oh, do you want to come back to be an investor? We want to bring on a partner in New York. So that's how that conversation started. And I had considered both going kind of continue the operating path and join another company, maybe a Series A stage startup, and be a VP of product and basically do this whole thing again, versus going back to investing, which I also enjoyed, although when I first did, I was pretty junior. But I just ended up deciding to go back to investing for a variety of different reasons, which happy to also share if that's relevant. So that's how I got to NextView. So I joined NextView as a partner about 4 years ago. And my job now is to invest in tiny little startups. We're a C-stage focused investing firm. So what that means is that most of the companies that we invest are like either concept stage or just launch, very little traction. And we write checks of $2-3 million to lead a $4 or $5 million round, and work with founders at very, very early stage, at most of the time pre-product market fit. And yeah, so that's the overview of a really weird career path.
感谢 Melody 的分享，我觉得这是个非常有趣，而且其实也不是很传统的 career path，
非常不传统。
对，尤其 MBA grad 来讲，我觉得也不是非常传统，
也非常不传统。对。
对，那根据你刚刚分享的，那我们有一些问题，就是说，其实 audience 也蛮有兴趣的嘛。那像第一个问题就是说，你刚刚有提到说你去 Harvard MBA， 但是你在 MBA 的时候其实都在做你的 startup 嘛。那你觉得你现在回想起来那段 MBA 的经验到底对你有没有帮助？那对于一些校友，如果说他们现在其实在考虑说，他想要做 startup， 但他又觉得他可能本身是技术背景，然后觉得去 MBA 可以学一些 business 的东西，那你觉得这样的 path 到底对于去 startup 有什么样的帮助，或是说你觉得根本没有必要这样子？也蛮想听你的看法。
Okay, so like I think there's a difference between people who have technical background and people without, people with business background. So for people with technical background, I actually think it's less of a distinction. Do you want to join a startup afterwards, or do you want to join a big company? I think it's more about function. So if you're a software engineer and you want to stay on the software engineer track, whether it's technical or management, like you can be an engineer manager and go to the management track, or you can be kind of principal software engineer and be an IC track. If you want to stay technical, I don't actually think you need an MBA. Now, if you want to eventually start your own company, or if you want to eventually go to product management, or even like have aspiration to be more of a strategic version of a senior engineer leadership, right? Because at the most senior level, a VP of Eng or a CTO, I think at some companies you want to be able to be pretty business minded. And you have to be a good counterpart with head of product. And if you want to have the capacity to do that, you need to have a certain level of business savvy, because otherwise you just get dragged around by the VP of engineer, VP of product, and the CEO. So I think with that in mind, it's more of a functional distinction. With that in mind, I think it's potentially worthwhile. And then if you have a business background, like kind of like my background, then I think the answer is a little less straightforward because business school is pretty expensive. Then I would say that, like, honestly, I think, you know, you want to go to a top 5 business program, because if you don't, like, because they all cost the same, and then the top 5 program, you know, top 6, however you cut it, like the top tier of the business program actually has dramatically more value when it comes to brand and network. And then, like, after that, you still pay this much, and then your network and brand value kind of decrease a little more steeply. So I think that math might not be as worthwhile. Now, there are a lot of other reasons. I think most of the reasons people would go do an MBA is kind of switch career track. So I think in general, that's going to be helpful. But I think, you know, to answer your question about startup, you know, even though I worked on my own startup most of the time I was there, and then business school is pretty expensive. I would recommend my experience, and I would say that I find it to be pretty helpful. I think, you know, I just think about, like, there are, you know, moments in my career, whether it was at Blue Apron or when I was working at my company, or now I'm an investor, when I run into challenges and things that I don't really know, I can, like, just, you know, figuratively pick up a phone and call my classmate, and there'll be somebody doing something that is a subject matter in whatever I'm trying to figure out. And, you know, fast forward, I graduated in 2013 from business school, and, you know, we're almost at 10 years mark. And a lot of my classmates are doing very impressive things, way more impressive than I am. And I just feel like that's a pretty interesting network that you get to be able to bring with you, regardless of where you go. But I would say if you're strictly stay on the technical round, then it's probably less necessary.
OK， 感谢分享。那像你当初在 MBA 之后，你说你加入过 Fed.com， 然后再去 Blue Apron 嘛？那其实很多人其实也蛮好奇，说你当初到底是怎么样去决定哪一个 startup 是值得加入的？因为尤其你其实有提到说你用过 Blue Apron 的产品，那你觉得它产品其实还不错，你也是 TA 这样子。但除了这个以外，我相信以你 finance 的 background， 你一定也有去大概看一下，说觉得这个市场可能是比较 potential 啊，或是有 maybe 看看 founder 是谁啊。那很多人其实都有这个问题，就是说到底要怎么样去决定哪一家 startup 才是比较有 potential， 然后比较适合自己的。
Yeah, it's not, so the first thing I would say is, like, try to think about it like an investor. I know that's kind of sometimes a little like, oh, I've never done investing, how do I think like an investor? But, you know, if you're putting your money into a company, right, then you're an investor. And if you choose to work at a startup, you're putting your blood, sweat, and tears into a company. So you are an investor. So you have to be very diligent about, you have to be very picky about how you think about the company. So I would generally break them down in a couple areas. One is the value proposition. What is the company trying to solve, and why is it important? And this applies to both B2B and consumer, or healthcare or whatnot, right? Like, what is the problem and pain point that this company's product is trying to solve? What's the value prop? Is it strong? And 2 is business model. Like, how do they make money, or how well they make money? And can you get behind how they make money? How do you think about margins? These are private companies, so they're not going to have readily available information at your disposal. You can't just go read their 10K, but you can try to ask some of these questions at interview, and then you might not get all the answers. If you're a pretty junior hire, you probably get zero information or very little information. If you're a pretty senior hire, they have to, you know, if they have to, like, close you as a candidate, they have to be able to share some things with you. And so you kind of want to be able to think about, what's the business model? What's the margin? Is there, like, technology leverage, operating leverage, and things like that? And then the third thing is competitive landscape, right? Who else is doing this? Why is this the company that's going to break out? Is it a winner take all market? Is it winner take most? Or is it like real estate? Kind of doesn't matter, because you can have Open Door and 5 other competitors kind of doing the same thing. And everybody can have a decent amount of market share because the market is so big. And then the last thing is probably the most important thing is people. Again, this is like cliche, but most founders at startups are crazy. So, and you want to, and they're crazy for a reason, because mostly like crazy people go build companies because it's not really a normal job for people to do. As a result, combined with the pressure of like trying to grow really fast, a lot of times it can result into all the way from like not great to a toxic culture. And a lot of these people are learning how to be manager the first time, myself included, when I was in the position to being promoted. So a lot of times they can also be pretty bad managers, and they're just like fixing things as they go because things are breaking all the time. So you kind of just want to make sure that you like the people, you look up to the people you're going to be reporting to the extent you get exposure to the management team and the leadership. You feel like, okay, I trust them to steer the ship, and I respect them. I feel like I have confidence in them. So not just like smart, but also can they be good people leaders, and do they care about the culture? Do they care about the team? Do they care about the people? So those are the things I probably will focus on. And then so that's one thing like investor. The other thing is the single most important thing, the single most like kind of trajectory changing opportunity if you're to join a company is if the company becomes a quote unquote rocket ship. Sheryl Sandberg kind of talked about this in her book. When you have a chance to get on the rocket ship, you get on, regardless what role or what seat that is. Now, the question is like, okay, how do I know if it's a rocket ship or not? It's pretty hard to know. She had the opportunity to join Google when there were 20 people, and it became Google, but it could also became like Alta Vista or Yahoo, right? So it's very hard to know. But there are a lot of benefits of why you want to join a company that has a high growth trajectory. Mainly because when it's high growth, I tend to describe it as like there's just opportunities on the floor for people to pick up all the time, like everywhere, because we're just going too fast and all this stuff needs to be fixed and all these problems need to be solved and we can't hire fast enough and we don't have enough people. And if you're smart, okay, you go fix this. And if you're smart, okay, you go grab all this stuff and like fix it for me. I don't really care what your title is. So that's the reason why it's really interesting and potentially very career changing if you can join something like that at kind of the steep trajectory, high growth. Now, it's pretty hard to figure out what company is going to be high growth when they're small. So it's usually easier when you're like, oh, you've raised like a few rounds of financing. You seem like you're like at the earlier onset of maybe like 100, 200 people. But it's a spectrum. Like the earlier you go, the more likely that you're going to be in a position to capture a lot of that early growth when it happens. The later you go, the more, kind of structured it is, but then like the role becomes more and more defined. The company seems to have its stuff together more, but it could become more corporate-y. So it's on the spectrum, and I think it's more of a personal choice of like what stage you want to go. But I think the easiest is probably like early growth. So like, raise like 1 or 2 rounds of financing, and it seems to be growing really fast. And you can actually, like, if you go on LinkedIn, you can see a company, how fast it's hiring, and you can see kind of the headcount growth. So that's like a pretty good hack of like, oh, this company seems to be adding a lot of heads. That probably means, that doesn't always mean it's a good business, but that's like one of the few signals that tells you like, oh, it's starting to like pick up hiring, and something must be going right for this company. Now, the last thing I want to say is, this is all important and like good for like optimizing your career and all that. But the most important thing is you have to like what the company is doing, and that you have to like the role that you're going to be in, because there is a decent amount of chance that you get it wrong. Meaning you're trying to hit the jackpot of like the high growth trajectory, the next rocket ship, and there's a chance you get it wrong. And many startups fail. So when all said and done, you want to be happy. So you don't want to just be like, oh, the only reason I'm working at this company is because I think it's a rocket ship. But what if that doesn't happen? And then you're going to be like sad and screwed and sitting at your desk and be like, oh, why am I here? So you actually want to be like, okay, is the company solving a problem that I'm actually interested in, right? Do I identify with the mission? Are the people I'm going to be working with smart, inspiring? Can I learn from them? Does the scope of the role interesting? So if those things the boxes are checked, and even if this company doesn't end up being like, the next Uber, you will still be happy and you'll still learn something. And I think the most important thing about like any kind of professional move is that you want to make sure you're also like, you always, every single move you make, you're like, okay, I'm going to be able to learn X. That's why I'm taking this role and joining this company. And you just want to make sure that that's true. And then all this stuff is like added bonus, all the value of the equity, your stock options and blah, 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 blah. That can all just be extra. So when it doesn't pay out, you're not going to be too sad.
对，没错。那但是其实我蛮好奇说，就是因为其实像你待 Blue Apron， 等于就是说从比较 early stage 然后到 late stage 这样这个过程你都经历过嘛？那你有没有什么样建议，就是给学妹们，就是说怎么样去发掘自己比较适合去 early stage， 然后从小开始奋斗到大，还是说比较适合去 late stage 一些比较 structure 一点的 startup 这样？
我觉得最主要是看个性，就是我先讲一下 pros and cons from my perspective， 就是 early versus late or / large company. And again, it's kind of all on the spectrum, right? Benefits of a large company / later stage is there's more structure. There's more defined career path. Like, oh, you joined as a PM1, and then if you check XYZ box, you become PM2, and then become senior product manager, and become blah blah blah. There's more of a defined career path. There's better training. There is, in theory, more experienced manager and management team. And there is more stability. There's probably better cash comp, more better benefits, medical benefits, time leave, stuff like that. Slower pace, which can be a pro or a con, depending on your personality. So downside of a large company / later stages could potentially be boring, slow, could feel like a pigeonhole, like a tiny scope. I use this example. Years ago, I interviewed a product manager who was at Facebook, and I was asking, "Oh, what is your product? What are you responsible for a product at Facebook?" And this is like years ago. On the Facebook web app, on the right-hand side, there's like a tiny section for widgets, and there's like a tiny section widget within that section, which is like a news widget. And he was like, "Oh, for the past 2 years, I worked on releasing this like the widget ranking system. I don't even remember, like some super tiny thing on the Facebook web app, but it impacts billions of people. And it took him 2 years to ship the feature. And I'm just like, oh my God, that is so boring. And then like, I don't know how much he learned in 2 years there, working on this tiny little widget app. Because at a start, at kind of where we were, you have to be able to like build the mobile app and go do this and go do that and like do 5 different things at the same time. So you can have more of a defined and tiny scope, and you potentially feel disconnected from the, like, oh, I'm just like a cog in the wheel. I'm doing a job of like one of 5,000 people. And I feel like my work is more disconnected from kind of the overall impact of the company. So that's large. The small on the flip side is like the benefits is like, kind of a high growth potential, transformative professional experience that I talked about. You can, potentially have equity that can be financially meaniful. The learning opportunity that comes with the potential steep trajectory, because your role is going to, in my experience, in my personal experience, which was really lucky, kind of like right place, right time. I feel like every 6 months I basically had a new job, and I was left to go figure out how to do the new job. So like sink or swim, but it can be a pro and con, right? Like for certain personalities, like, oh my God, I don't actually want that. I want hand-holding and structure and very defined path. But for certain other personalities, like, oh great, I get to like do all this stuff because no one else is doing. And I was given an opportunity to kind of audition for my next role. And then if I do well, they just put more on my plate. And then it could be very stressful, but it could be very professionally rewarding as well. It could be more fun if you are a smaller company, because I tell people when I joined, we're at 20 people. And my happiest time at Blue Apron was probably from 20 people all the way to like 150. I knew all the chefs, the customer service people, our culinary writers, our supply chain people. I understood exactly how our warehouse worked, knew all the marketers, obviously product engineering, design. I could just get in the room with the CEO and the head of marketing, and three of us spend half an hour like, okay, this is what we're going to do. We're going to go do it. Versus having a 20-person meeting for like 5 weeks, and then we would never decide on anything and can't move as fast. So, you can, if the company is growing fast, there's also a tendency of that they can hire pretty good people who are very motivated and driven and smart. So you also feel like the talent bar is pretty high, so long as the company is growing fast. And, more freedom to pick up stuff that you want to work on. Now, the downside is a lot of work and potentially a lot of stress. You feel very emotionally invested the earlier you join. I was very emotionally invested, even though I was not a founder. It felt like my company because I was there since like day 2. And that can be, the emotional roller coaster is very ups and downs. And you just feel like you get dragged around by the emotional. The highs are very fun and high. The lows are very low and disturbing, I guess. And chaos. There's like chaos everywhere all day. And you're either the personality type is like, okay, chaos is here, I'm gonna like tackle it, or the like, oh no, I can't deal with chaos. Because what does chaos mean? It's like, oh, today we're gonna build X, and tomorrow, oh shoot, competitors doing Y, so we have to go do Y. Or CEOs, crazy founder CEOs say, hey, throw everything that you've been working on the past 2 months, we're gonna do Z. And we're like, wait, hold on, but we just talked about X last week. I'm like, no, I want Z and I want X. We're like, wait, but we don't have enough bandwidth to do both. I'm like, no, I want it all happen tomorrow. So it's like chaos and work. In it potentially inexperienced management team, and sometimes lacking clarity in terms of career path, because you're like, okay, now we have product managers who've been here 2 years. They want to be promoted. Okay, I got to go figure out what does it mean to be promoted. Do we put a title? What's the career path? I have to like write the whole thing out. In Blue Apron year 4, we finally had our engineering career ladder. Like, oh, you're a software engineer 1. And then you check these boxes, then you become software engineer 2. And it was very ad hoc before then. So it's very different kind of feel. So I think it's mainly really a personality thing on that spectrum.
了解。那其实你刚刚讲的也蛮有趣的，就是说不同的 personality 会适合不同 phase 的公司嘛。那但是其实还蛮有趣，就是说其实去 startup 很多人都会觉得说，不像大公司会有比较 structured 的 growth plan 啊，然后让你去学习啊。那所以如果说是一个比较没有经验的人，那加入 startup 的话，那他到底要怎么样的去学习他工作上面需要有的？那尤其像你说，你可以在 product， 然后你又去带 product design， 然后你又去带 analytics， 那这些东西你可能以前都没有做过，那你是要怎么样在这种 hyper growth 的环境里面去让自己成长？
对，所以我的建议就是，通常大学刚毕业第一个工作不要去 startup， 因为第一个工作 so here's the reason why， 第一个工作或是第二个工作，头几年 you want to be trained. You need to have your basic professional toolkit, like from how to write an email to, how to like estimate the amount of work and say, oh, I'm going to get it done on Tuesday, and I'll get it done on Tuesday, right? How to set expectations up, how to communicate across, how to just be like a professional, and like your technical toolkit, right? So you don't really want to join a 20-person startup and be left alone, because it's really hard to pick up these professional toolkit. So that's why I recommend people not join a startup with a first and or second job. Now, I think thinking about like, again, kind of reflecting on the Blue Apron experience, by that time, I had enough professional experience to arm me to say like, oh, even though I've never done product management before, I had enough like picking up things at work, learning experience. Like, oh, this is like how I can go about learning X. And I feel like mid-career is probably the more appropriate time to join an early stage company because you'll feel more prepared, even though you might not have the exact functional experience. You know how to navigate, and you can kind of rely on your toolkit to help you problem solve. So that's one. And then like the other thing I would say is the most important attitude or attribute that like when I used to hire people, I look for, and that's very critical at joining anything before a large company is the attitude of saying that like I can learn this and I'm going to go on the internet to learn, because or from your colleagues, because there really is nothing that can't be learned, especially with this in this day and age. And for example, right, like I was not a technical major, and my first product job, I remember I was interviewing for this job at Fab, and on the JD it said, oh, SQL required or SQL preferred. I was like, oh, I don't know what SQL is. So I just like went on, I think it was like the Stanford online database class. And I just like sat there for 5 hours. Like, I know if else where, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, oh, okay, I know SQL. And then I went into the interview. Of course, they never tested me SQL, but I showed up at the job and we didn't have an analytics team. So as a product person, you have to be able to pull data. And if you're waiting for someone to like, for your data request to sit in the queue for 5 days, you're not going to be fast on your job. So I was like, oh, now I can like go into the database and like pull stuff out. And once I knew how to do that, I'm like, oh, now I understand like schema design and I understand our database structure. And then like help me understand like how our software was written. And even though I was not technical, I got to be technical enough because I was able to kind of try to learn things and I've, of course, be friends with engineers and ask them questions. And same goes with technical, more technical background people trying to learn business side of things. It's very similar. I think there's really is nothing you can't learn. It's just a matter of attitude and kind of have to believe in yourself that you can actually learn it. And the one thing you asked about business school, right? Like this is actually where the MBA degree was helpful for me, kind of from like my self-belief and self-confidence. Because as women, first of all, the 3 founders of Blue Apron are all men, and most of the senior leaders are men. And you're in a room with all these men, and you will otherwise be like, oh, should I be sitting here? Am I like, and I was like, I don't know, I was like 29 or 28, but I went to HBS and the CEO went to HBS. So he's like 2 years older than me. And I was like, well, if you can do it, I'm not any like less smart than you, so I can figure this out. And so like, yeah, I think it just really helped with like, if all, you and you all, we all did kind of the same thing, and we all went to this best high school in Taiwan, right? So like, we all can figure this out. It's not that difficult. And then I think I actually was really helpful from like, showing up and presenting and especially being women, in an environment that's like heavily male dominant. And, I think the added benefit is like people just like check the box, like, oh, your baseline smart, and you deserve a seat at the table. So we'll stop questioning your qualification and we'll go into the actual subject matter you're trying to talk about, right? Otherwise, you have to spend 20 minutes just to prove that you belong there. And that's really detrimental when it comes to like, when the more senior you get, the more problematic it potentially becomes.
所以其实中你刚刚所讲的就是比较像是说你在第一份第二份工作先去累积一些 basic foundation， 然后之后其实就是比较靠自己学习，然后靠你的 driven 的 attitude 去成长这样子。
对。
那其实蛮有趣的，就是其实很多人就问到说，像你刚刚说的，就是说要靠自己去学习成长啊，然后环境也蛮 stressful 的。那其实，在 startup 的话，你会觉得 work-life balance 是非常的差吗？就是其实大家都还蛮好奇这个问题的，而且你要怎么样去兼顾就是 personal 的 relationship？ 因为你也提到说你好像 MBA 毕业之后就结婚嘛，那你这样的话，怎么样去 maintain 你的 family 的 relationship 这样子？
对，第一个就是找一个老公是对于你工作很怎样，我中文实在是很不好，就是 find a husband who's not going to care whether you work a lot, at least before you have kids. 所以这是 no, he's always been very supportive. 他不是那种就是会被 threatened 的那种，因为 so we're like dual career household. And you know, to be honest, like I was working like a dog when I was at Blue Apron. I think my 3.5 years there are 2.5 years where I worked every single weekend. Probably like 70 hours a week, something like that. Especially when I need to hire a lot of people. And we didn't have a recruiting function built up. And I was responsible for my own hiring because one day I don't have these people, I have to do the work myself. And I was dying. So I was like, I got to hire these people. So I just spent hours on LinkedIn sourcing people to interview and reach out and personally reach out to my network. So that was a lot of work. So I think when you're, you know, I think it's a trade-off. I'm glad I did it before I had kids, because that's not attainable once you have kids. That kind of schedule is not attainable once you have kids. And I think that it was a dude that was happy to pay. And I would also really like my work. So I was like glued to my work basically for 3.5 years. But I feel like that was like a sprint. And after that, I was like, oh, that's why I wanted to leave after we go public. I was like, oh, this is like dog years. It's, you know, the 3.5 years is like 6 years of my life. 就是好像一下老了很多年那种感觉。So I reported to the CTO co-founder, and one day I showed him, I was like, see, I have my first white hair. This is all because of you guys. And I had like this back pain that became chronic, and he feels so bad. He bought me like gift certificate to go to the spa or something. But you know, it was just a lot of work, but it was really rewarding. I think, but you know, I think in terms of like generally, the earlier you go, the more chaotic it is. But I think every company is different. You know, that being said, like Blue Apron was a business that had like a logistic component. So there's like fire drill all the time because every time there's a snowstorm, people are not getting their boxes. And all the leadership team got on a conference call nonstop to like manage that because customers are expecting their boxes. So things like that. And I think, you know, even in pure software, you have fire drills, like site goes down and things like that. If you're like on-call engineer, you have to wake up at 3 a.m. to make sure the site gets back up. Right. So I think it's just a little bit more of a personal choice.
了解。你刚刚有提到就是说其实会去做 startup founder 的人其实都有一点 crazy， 你让我想到那个 better.com 嘛。那其实我还蛮好奇说你觉得这算是一个非常 typical 的 founder 吗？还是说他算是比较 outlier 的？
他比较 extreme， 但是so I mean it's not okay, so it's not it's not I didn't mean it to be a blanket statement that all founders are crazy. They're crazy in some aspects because like I said, it's a really like I was a founder for a minute and it was the most psychologically draining period of my professional and personal career. And you just like the weight on your shoulder is different, very different than from early employee. Like at Blue Apron, I was emotionally invested. I was very stressed, but then I was like, you know, at home, I go home like, okay, this is Matt's company. It's not my company. I don't have to like, I can go to sleep. I don't have to worry about what happens tomorrow. If things don't go well at people's jobs and stuff like that. So it's like a totally different level of stress. And to succeed in that role and to be, you know, so there must be like aspects of their personality that's like a little cray-cray, right? So the better.com is like more of extreme, but you know, you don't have to be an asshole to be a successful founder. So that's the distinction, right? And I think that you can be aggressive and hard charging and really focusing on growing a company, but at the same time, very mission driven and cares about your people and team, even though maybe they're just doing it so that they can build a great company, right? Maybe they don't actually care. Maybe they just like do things that show that they care so that they can retain good talent, but that means that they're smart. And so I don't necessarily think that in order to be a successful founder, you have to be an asshole. Like you have to be you be an ass, right? Like you can be a good human being and you can actually like care about the company and the culture. And those are hopefully the things that you find for the company that you're joining. Because if that's not the case, even though your direct manager is great, he or she can protect you from the bad culture that comes from the top.
OK， 那这其实就接到我下一个问题，就是说for those people who joined startup， 就是要怎么样去决定说现在是该 exit 了，就是说不应该再继续待在这个 startup 了，该去其他公司看看了。
The easiest way to think about it is when you stop learning, when you feel like, the other reason why I decided to leave at the time the IPO is I feel like my learning curve was very steep. So I described the metaphor as like, oh, I'm always climbing a mountain. But then the problem is like, the minute you climb this mountain, 你合欢山爬完就哇，又要去爬玉山，妈呀！然后 that's not a good analogy. 爬高里山爬完就啊。妈，又要去爬玉山，1秒钟都没办法休息，就是然后所以你随时都在爬下一个高山。But at some point I was like, I don't feel like I'm climbing as steep anymore, which means my job got easier. But then at the same time I was like, well, it's not as challenging anymore. 那就表示你的 learning speed is slowed down. 那that's when I feel like you need to switch to a different environment, right? So that's probably the best way to think about it. I mean, switching can be switching internally to a different role, or externally to a different company. And the other, obviously there are other considerations like, oh, how vested are my stock options? And then, there's an annoying rule about stock options that most companies have it so that you have to exercise within 90 days after you leave. But in order to exercise, one, you have to pay an exercise price, which is cash. And two, you have to pay the capital gain on the fair market value of the stock, even though it's illiquid. So this is more of an advanced topic. But the long story short is that you might not have the cash to pay for the tax, but IRS is like, oh, you made money on paper, pay me real dollars, even though your paper stock option is not liquid until the company goes public or be bought, right? So that potentially is a tricky timing for people. And that's why people sometimes wait till there's an exit event, because they need the cash to know when to exercise and pay taxes. So that's like a separate consideration, but I would mainly focus on like, are you learning? And if your learning speed has slowed down, I think it's time to consider going somewhere else, especially when you're still early in your career.
OK, got it. 那我们其实蛮好奇说，那像现在你离开了 Blue Apron 了，那你觉得以 Blue Apron 一个就是说一个新创，然后 go through IPO， 然后到现在变成了一个 public company， 那你觉得他们现在的发展是如他们之前预期的吗？还是说你觉得有点走偏了或者怎么样？蛮好奇你的想法。
That's a whole. It's a very long story. The short version of it is the company tried. So a couple of things. One, the competitive landscape got too crowded, and two, the defensibility of the business ended up being less than what we thought. We thought it was more defensible than it actually is. And three, there's honestly like mismanagement and execution very close to the time when we were going public. So we basically screwed up ourselves right around the time we're going public. And that was really bad because once you become a public company, you're under the scrutiny of daily stock price. It's very distracting. And you have to report to public investors. When you're a private company, even if you're not doing well, you just hide, right? Like no press is good press, right? Like you just hide and fix your problems. It's okay. But when you're a public company, you have to report quarterly earnings. So I think it's a little unfortunate because, I think it was truly on a trajectory of being something meaningful. And, I think now like the value is like 1/10 of when we went public. Unfortunately, so like, I think it was culturally, took a lot of hit right after I left, because they had to go through layoffs and things like that. That being said, I'm going on a ski trip with most of my team in March, and like the Blue Apron crew and people you met are still extremely tight, and they feel nice enough to invite me, even though they're mostly people on my team. And I have a lot of friends and that came from kind of working there. When we were small, we used to do happy hour every Thursday. I don't know how I could drink this much, but happy hour every Thursday was a lot of drinking. And this is like when I was like 28. So a very different story. But, I think that like, it's unfortunate that like the performance post going public became that way. But I still, feel like that was, if I were to choose to do it again, I'd totally choose to do the same thing again. And because that really is kind of a career trajectory changing experience for me personally. Had I not be able to go through that, I probably would have had the opportunity to join, come back to investing as a partner. And I'm able to leverage that experience and skill set to work with founders I work with now. So.
OK， 了解。那像我们现在聊了很多，就是你在 startup 的经验嘛。那我们现在就到了就是你的 next phase， 就是 as an investor。那其实我们还蛮想了解说，像你的life as a startup operator versus as an investor， 你觉得就是这样的转换有什么比较大的变化？那有什么比较不一样的经验可以跟大家分享一下？
我通常 describe they're like totally opposite job. Just as an operator, you get to build, especially in technical field, right? You're an engineer, you're a product person, you're building stuff. Marketers a little less direct, right? But you're building things and you're like, oh, we need to solve problem X, or we need to hit metrics Y. And so here's a hypothesis, and we go like solution, you're like solutioning all the time and you're problem solving. As an investor, it's like totally not that. It's like totally not hands-on. Your job is every day just meet founders and you're trying to assess, are they really strong? Are they working on something interesting? It's very qualitative and it's very like not concrete. And then, it's also like, I also describe it as like grandparents versus parents. Like as an operator, you're more directly emotionally invested and tied to the kind of the roller coasters, the ups and downs I described, which can be good and bad. It's more rewarding, right? When you have a win, you enjoy it directly. When you have a loss, you kind of suffer from that emotionally. When you are an investor, you're kind of 1 degree removed. The companies that you invest in have success, and you're like, oh yay, they have success, but you weren't participating directly, right? You kind of indirectly enabled that by giving them money and talking to the CEO and coaching them and being on the board. So the highs are not as high and the lows are not as low. And it's a portfolio, right? You have a basket of investments as opposed to you have one company you're devoting 100% of your energy thinking about problems all day long in that specific area. The other difference is that as an investor, I describe this job as a good job if you're intellectually ADD. Like you're just like very intellectually curious about all sorts of stuff, and you're like, oh, today I'm looking at a drones company, and tomorrow I'm thinking about alcohol addiction, and the day after that I'm looking at a baby formula company, which by the way we have all these companies in our portfolio. And versus working at a company, you get to go really deep, like, oh, food meal kit, how do I build a mobile app that like incentivize people to order from us every week? And how do we think about personal preferences and choice and build machine learning models to predict that? You can go very deep on a vertical and really own the problem space. And that's pretty rewarding itself. Just very different. And then the last thing I'll say is like the hardest thing about being an early stage venture capital investing is it's very hard to know if you're actually good because it takes 10 years. Like you invest in a company and then 10 years later, something happens, hopefully, or nothing happens, and then it's bad. So it's really hard. Like I feel like almost any other job, you can be like, okay, I want to figure out how to be best. And you can kind of figure out like, okay, here's the playbook to be the best product person or the best engineer or the best data scientist. And I just like go do X, Y, Z and I can like be really good. As an investor, it's really hard to know how to actually do that because the inputs and outputs are so far from each other. Like you take all these meetings and you meet all these founders and you invest in companies and 10 years later, something happens. And you don't know whether that's because of you or because you're lucky or because it has nothing to do with you. And you can't be like, oh, because I did X, Y happened, so I'm going to do more X. Like it's very hard to do that, and versus in all operating jobs, I think you can kind of do that. So the investing job can be frustrating in that way.
OK。但是像你自己，如果是当过 operator 之后再去当 VC， 你会不会有时候都会很想要跳下去，然后就说，哎，你不应该这么做？
刚开始会，现在不会。就是 that's actually a pretty bad intuition because as an investor, you're not trying to. Sometimes you're like, oh, let's say I hear a pitch of an idea. I'm like, oh, that's interesting if you can execute it X, Y, and Z way. But the problem is you're backing a team who needs to execute X, Y, and Z. So if it comes to you to do the X, Y, and Z, then you failed. So you can't actually get into that tendency because most of the time you're like, then you're just picking the wrong team. So, our job is actually more of like, the best way to describe it is being a strategic sounding board. Like founders come to you to bounce ideas off, and hopefully I can ask the right questions to help them think around the corners and think ahead and leverage my experience to say, hey, make sure to think about X, Y, Z, or have you thought about A? And if they haven't thought about A, that's my value add. And they can kind of waste less time and be able to kind of leverage some of the experience and move faster.
了解。那听起来其实as an investor 这经验其实是跟 as an operator 是非常不一样的嘛。那你当初是从 investor 又跳到 operator， 那为什么会在 Blue Apron IPO 之后，那又会想要回来当 investor 呢？
我当初有考虑，第一个就是说继续在 operating，第二个就是到 investing。那 so operating I had two choices. One is to join a large company, which I already decided I didn't want to do that because I didn't like being a senior exec at a large company. Like as the company got larger, I got less happier. So I was like, okay, then I joined a startup. So I'm going to join like a Series A or Series B stage startup and kind of be a VP of product and help basically do this thing again. Then I was like, well, if the company was successful, we're going to kind of land at the same spot because I also did this, we joined when we were super early and then scaled the business and got to a point of like scale and exit at IPO. So at best, I would like kind of see the same movie again, even though it's not the same company or industry. And that's not to say that I won't learn anything new, but I realized that. So I was actually interviewing with one other role, like a Series B, Series A, very high growth stage company in New York at the time. They're looking for a VP of product. Actually, like two business school classmates of mine started this company. And so I was talking to them and I met all their senior team and had walks with the founder. And I went back home and I was telling my husband, I was like, oh yeah, I'm talking to this company and this is how the job will be like, blah, 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 blah. And then he was like, you should not take that job. You'll be bored in 6 months. And I was like, okay, I guess that's right. And so, it was the benefits I could like, here, I know how to be a VP of product now. I can like deploy my playbook and go hire people and set up processes and do this and do that. But I think given my personality, it was going to be more similar than different. And I wasn't going to be as energized by it. And the company, if successful, the company eventually becomes big and I've got the same problem again. So the idea to come back to investing was like, okay, well, if I'm doing early stage investing, I can always work with companies that are very early stage and I can always, because I'm always doing C stage investing. So I can always work with founders at a very early stage. And that seemed pretty interesting to me. And I also feel like this time around, I get to leverage some of the stuff I learned when I was building companies. And I feel like that could be pretty rewarding working with founders that way. And I like my partners at NextView. And I like the idea of being able to kind of build a venture capital firm together for the next decade. So that's a combination of different things that led me to kind of coming back to investing.
那你怎么会选择是比较 focus 在 early stage 的 investment， 而不是说比较偏向 growth stage 啊，或是比较 late stage 一点的 investment？
That's a good question. Typically with people with more like financy background, they're theoretically more suited to go to later stage. But to be honest, like I just had this opportunity in front of me, and I had done venture investing before, so I know the ecosystem and the players. So I knew kind of which firm had what culture and whether I would like that or not. And kind of similar to my personal tendency to go to smaller places that are more entrepreneurial. I didn't want to join like a 30-year-old venture fund with like bazillion partners because I just feel like it's not really interesting, even though you might get paid more. In fact, you do get paid more. And, you potentially have a more well-known brand. I just found that opportunity, I also like the very similar to kind of joining a company, like I need to like my partners. I don't want to deal with politics within the partnership. And I feel like, life is too short. You got to work with people that you enjoy working with, who are not assholes and are good people and smart. So it was kind of that. And plus, I never done seed investing before. My previous venture role was more Series A, Series B, but I really like it. And so that turned out to be a good decision.
OK。好，感谢。那我觉得现在这个部分就是我们ABEF 准备的问题，比较跟你 career 有关的问题。那我们刚刚都已经 address 了。那接下来有一些问题是 audience 他们 submit， 然后蛮有趣的问题。那而且尤其是跟你的 background 比较相关。那接下来就是 Q&A session。那第一个问题就是，你有没有就是给for people who want to start their own company, do you have any advice?
Yeah. So. One is there's one thing that regardless what type of company you start, you have to do, which is to build a really strong team. So my advice is, even though you think you might start a company 5 years from now, or 3 years from now, or even a decade from now, start building a network of really strong people. Because if you're the founder CEO, let's say you work on an idea, then you're like, oh, the idea is actually decent and you can like expand and you can scale. The very next thing you have to face is you have to attract talent. You have to hire other people so that you can scale your time, right? You can't just be the engineer and the product person, the salesperson, and the marketer all in one forever. So a very actionable thing, regardless of what the eventual idea is actually build a network of really strong people. Like one extreme version of this advice is that, when you're starting a company, you should have a short list of 5 to 10 people that you're ready to hire the moment you have funding. And then these people will actually follow you. So that's a little bit extreme. You don't necessarily have to have that, but obviously it would be really helpful if you have that. And the related advice to that is like, okay, well, you have a list, that's one thing, but are they going to follow you? That's another, right? So how do you make sure you can convince and attract them when you're ready, right? So I think that just comes to like kind of building a great track record professionally, and anywhere you go, right? The easiest way to get to know these people is as your colleagues. So this is again like joining a place that has other high performing peers and who recruit really top talent, because you hear the stories of, PayPal mafia, or people from Uber or Facebook or Google or Instagram or whatever starting companies because they can like grab their colleagues who are good. They're like, oh, I know who is good. And then I also was respected when I was there. So when I'm ready to like wave the flag, say join me, people actually come join me. So the related advice is like always just do excellent work and build a strong reputation wherever you go, because people have to trust you, and then they have to respect you and think that like, oh, they're gonna like get a pay cut to follow you, and you have to have that reputation. So that's probably the most universal advice when it comes to starting companies.
那像as an investor， 你在看这些比较 early stage 的新創的时候，那你都是怎么样决定说是有什么 factor 让你决定说你要去 invest in these companies?
Usually it's people, market, and product. People, it's the most obvious, is like, going back to kind of we're not doing the work for them. The team is doing most of the work, right? So kind of, I mean, this is a generic way of describing it, is like how exceptional this team is. And by exceptional is like, we usually look for signals that people have done extraordinary things in their career, whether it's have a very steep professional trajectory, have done a lot, and just like high achievers, which is not a foreign concept for everybody who's gone to Beini, right? So like high achieving individuals who have very steep trajectory professionally. And then, you know, a team that has the right relevant experience for the problem that you're solving, right? I'll give you a very simple example. If you're building the next generation consumer social app that try to be the next Snapchat for Gen Z, for example, you better have really strong consumer product background on your team. You can't have two enterprise SaaS people say, oh, I'm going to build a like next generation consumer social app. I don't necessarily going to believe you that you know how to do that. Conversely, right? Like you're like, oh, I want to build next generation Salesforce. And then you have like a consumer marketing person and a consumer product person who has never sold into enterprise or never done bottoms up SaaS sale or whatever, right? You don't know anything about SaaS when it comes to product or go to market, then that potentially is a mismatch. So there's team and there's like in absolute terms, like their level of like excellence and as well as whether their skill set and background and network fit the problem that they're trying to solve. We call that like kind of founder market fit. And then there's a market. How big is the market, right? Oh, if you're solving, I was trying to think of a good example. If you're doing something in call like pet grooming services, like, oh, okay, that could be a decent sized market. But if you're like, oh, I'm going to sell, build a software for booking to help pet grooming companies better be able to book their appointments. I'm like, oh, is that big enough? Is that like a couple $1 billion market or is it a $20 billion market? And if it's like, oh, it's a $2 billion market. Okay, well, even if you own 10% of a $2 billion market, that's only $200 million in revenue. And you're not going to own 10%. So that's probably too small of a market. So like, think about market size. The market size fallacy is Uber. When Uber first started, everybody thought it was a taxi company. And like, oh, how big is the taxi market? Well, as it turns out, you really can't think of Uber like that because it's kind of, it's addressing something that's more of just generally transportation and movement of goods and people. And because of the technology kind of dramatically opened up the amount of people who would take taxi, kind of multiplied the existing market. So there's like a little bit of trickiness in terms of how to think about markets sometimes. For something that doesn't really exist or something that a technology can change behavior in a very dramatic way. And the last thing is product. I mean, at our stage, a lot of times the product is not built. So it's not really assessing the product at a current state. It's about how do you think about the product and how would you actually approach the product building? But those are generally 3 buckets of things that we consider.
OK， 了解。那下一个问题是，以你的观察 ，How has the startup ecosystem been affected by COVID in the past few years?
From like a fundraising perspective, everybody moved very swiftly to being able to, investors able to meet companies without in-person meeting, which was never really the case. Like for us, used to be, in order for us to get comfortable, we used to always have to meet the founder in person. But now, since COVID, everybody has done investments by Zoom only. So that's one. 2, company building has become way more dispersed. As you all know, right? Like a lot of you are probably working remotely, full-time or partially. And I think as a result, the talent ecosystem is getting a little more dispersed, right? People from the Bay Area moving to, I don't know, Wyoming, Austin, Florida, people in New York going to somewhere potentially slightly warmer. I think that, it's still early in the social experiment. I personally don't believe that it's easy to build a completely remote culture. A lot of that stuff that I talked about, like the camaraderie, the togetherness, the mission alignment, and the pace that you can move at, that was a lot of in-person time. And the fun was also a lot of the in-person time. So I think it's very hard for a company to, not to say it's impossible, I think it's very hard for the company to continue to scale by being completely remote. But I think in the near term, the talent ecosystem is definitely more dispersed. So you're seeing more kind of multiple location-based companies, which is good because I think that, startups can compete for talent everywhere. You're not limited to the Bay Area or New York for your talent pool. And I think it's also, this is the best time for employees because you have a lot of options because the hiring market is very tight. The last thing I'll say is that, COVID obviously made accelerated certain industries like digital health because of the ease of regulation, e-commerce, and a couple, probably a few other, kind of rethinking what the future of work means. Like, how do we all work together? Probably there's going to be a next generation of tools that will come out, like to help with collaboration, to help with team building, and to help with even managing, like, you kind of from an HR management perspective, I need to know who is where spending what amount of time because I need to like plan my corporate footprint for the next couple of years. So I think there's going to be like a next generation of tools that will come out that will help kind of the knowledge worker, desk worker, also the deskless worker, the frontline workers to figure out how they work and transition that. But I don't think we know what the end state looks like because everybody's still figuring it out, even the year 2 of COVID.
对，而且其实蛮有趣，你提到就是说现在比较容易到各个地方去 hire 人，但是我觉得现在要 retain employee 也很难，因为大家真的是坐在家里，然后面试就换工作了。
对，而且你坐在家里，你那个 sense of belonging is not as strong. 你比较不会，你比较觉得说 you're like an agent as opposed to you're part of a company, I think. And so I think that impacts retention as well. You don't feel like you're as part of something, probably as what you've been able to feel if you're kind of spending time with the coworkers at the same place every day.
Yeah, exactly. 那最后一个问题，我觉得一定要问，而且我自己本身也蛮有兴趣，就是说，如果是一个 Taiwanese startup， 那他们想要 landed at US， 那你有什么样的 suggestion 吗？或者说你之前有看过什么样的成功案例吗？因为我觉得其实现在还蛮多就是 Asia 的 startup 其实还蛮想要进到美国，那尤其你刚刚又说现在其实 pitch VC 啊什么很多都是 remote 就可以了，那你有没有什么样的建议就是给 Taiwanese 的 startup？
这个其实是一个 tricky question， 因为是一个很难的事情。So I think it depends on like what's the definition of a Taiwanese startup, right? 如果你是一个 Taiwanese 团队，但是有在美国的 DNA, I think it's a lot easier, right? Let's say like, because I think so enterprise B2B 跟 consumers, two separate things, right? Consumer is very, very hard unless you have the US DNA, because otherwise you don't really know kind of the user behavior, the marketing know-how is very different. So consumer and then B2B, like you have to build a sales team. You have to kind of be able to know how to go to market here. And in the very early days of a startup, it's all very founder-driven network sales. Oh, let me call up everybody I know on LinkedIn to try my product. And the first couple sales is always founder-led, network-driven. And if you don't have a natural network here, then I think it becomes more difficult. And then if you don't have natural, like, network here, the attracting US-based investors is also difficult. So I mean, in terms of like tactical advice, I think that like, again, depends on like what's the definition of a Taiwanese startup. If you're completely Taiwan-based, right? Now, if you have the ambition to tackle the US market, I think you have to be as early as possible to like have part, if not majority of your senior team with like the US DNA. I mean, you can work from Taipei, but like you have to be more, I think you have to have a more US native team, both from the network and know-how and understanding the go-to-market side of things. The other thing I found is 台湾现在比较没有什么 software product talent， 因为台湾没有什么 software 公司，所以台湾 台湾做 software 很多就是做 project， 不是做 product， 因为台湾的市场不够大，所以并没有办法撑起很多 software company， 所以台湾的 software product management 这个 talent pool 其实是很小的。那就因为都是比较都是硬体，所以我觉得那是另外一个 challenge， 就是说如果你是做软体的，或是 anything software based， 那你的 product team 基本应该是要在这儿。可是那如果你的 product team 在这儿，如果你的 engineer team 在台北的话 ，that's also very challenging。因为我在 Fab 的时候 I was a PM， 我们是在纽约，然后我们的 engineering team 全部都在 India，that was very difficult。我 every 6 weeks go to India for a whole week just to like work with engineers and like dump specs and make sure like we can communicate and having on Skype every day。这是 pre-COVID， 对不对？所以就是那样子的 collaboration 其实非常困难。所以我觉得说，就是说如果你 even if you have a part of the engineering team based in Taiwan， 你还是希望就是说有一些 engineer 跟 technology product stuff here。因为我觉得现在如果你是 software 的话，在台湾的这个 talent bench 可能还不够深。
有啊，不过我觉得现在算是有越来越多了。
对
毕竟软体是一个
对
OK， 了解。好啊，那谢谢 Melody 你今天的分享，我觉得今天非常非常的棒，而且我感觉到观众非常的 engage， 大家都留到最后，所以这是非常好的事。这样，那不知道说您有没有什么联络方式啊，或者愿不愿意就是留一些联络方式啊，或者是说愿不愿意让大家跟你在LinkedIn 上面 connect， 如果说他们有一些相关的问题啊，或是 startup 相关的问题这样子。
最容易的应该是我的 Twitter DM， 就是 Melody Co。如果有什么 specific question 可以 DM 我。I'm happy to answer questions if people have questions and just either DM me on Twitter or on LinkedIn。
OK， 好，没问题。那今天很谢谢 Melody 参与，然后跟大家分享这样。那今天活动就到此为止。那我们很谢谢 Melody 今天所给的所有的内容，然后我觉得非常的棒。
随便乱讲，应该应该够 entertaining。
我觉得非常的棒。至少我们团队都觉得这是一个非常棒的 content。这样。
好，谢谢大家，谢谢大家。
好，谢谢
大家加油。OK， 好，拜拜。
谢谢，拜拜。